It's June 1942, and Colonel Leslie Groves is sitting in his new office in Manhattan. He is working on the plans for a massive engineering project that would result in the creation of the most dangerous weapon known to man. This project is based in Manhattan for two main reasons. Firstly, Groves can get administrative support from the Army Corps of Engineers North Atlantic Division. He is actually working in their headquarters right now. And secondly, it is close to Columbia University, where 2 years earlier, scientists had replicated a German experiment which led to the first fission reaction in the Western Hemisphere. As was traditional for engineering projects, this endeavour was named after the district in which it was headquartered. The Manhattan Project would span the continent and cost about $2 billion. At its peak, it employed 130,000 people. The United States had the benefit of working with two of the richest and best educated partners in the world. The project employed many of the world's greatest scientists, including multiple that had escaped fascism in Europe. It happened on a continent that was untouched by war, being free of any strategic bombing or enemy armies marching on their shores. And they did it in the largest economy in the world, funded by the richest government on the planet. During this era, a project of this cost and scale could only happen in the United States of America. They managed to create the first nuclear bomb in a mere 3 years. After the war, the Soviets would do it in 4. How is it possible that the Soviet Union at this time could match this American achievement? The Soviets had just had half their country destroyed and lost 27 million people in the war. Many of those lost were able-bodied soldiers, which are exactly the kind of people you need for a massive engineering project like this. Well, it did help that the Soviets didn't have to start from scratch. The Soviets had many capable scientists who had contributed to nuclear physics in the 1920s and 30s. But when Operation Barbarossa began, Stalin stopped much of the scientific research which was not directly related to the war effort. Georgy Flyarov, a nuclear scientist who had become an engineer in the Soviet Air Force, wrote a letter to Stalin. He noted that while other areas of physics continued to have papers published, nuclear physics fell completely silent in Germany, Britain, and America. Clearly, these countries had all started a secret program to create a nuclear weapon, and the Soviets would have to do the same to keep up. Stalin actually agreed to do this, but it was nothing compared to the Manhattan Project. It had barely any funding and only about 20 physicists on its roster. This program ramped up considerably once the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviets also had some other advantages which hastened their development of the bomb. They were able to, let's say, recruit many German scientists who had worked on the Nazi nuclear bomb project, which was far more advanced than what the Soviets had managed during the war. The Soviets were also able to access lots of uranium, not only from their own mines, but also from ample deposits in Soviet-occupied Germany and Czechoslovakia. Around this time, 74% of Soviet uranium came from this area. The Soviet NKVD secret police took control of the mines and employed a former Gulag commander to implement, let's call them worker motivation strategies, to increase output. The Soviets also used other Gulag labor and prisoners of war in other locations to create the bomb. All of these were very important, but the Soviets had one more advantage, and this one is truly massive. The Soviets had spies in the Manhattan Project, and they stole the secrets of the bomb and delivered them back to Moscow. One of those spies was Klaus Fuchs. He was a German physicist who fled to the United Kingdom after the Nazi crackdown on communists. He worked for the British in their nuclear research before joining the Manhattan Project and being moved to Los Alamos in 1944. From 1942 to 1949, Fuchs handed off secret information about the bomb to Soviet spies who then smuggled it to the Soviet embassy. He supplied a rough blueprint of the bomb, information on how to enrich uranium, and material about an at the time theoretical hydrogen bomb. He also gave the Soviets updates on the United States uranium production rates, and also the date of the first successful nuclear test. He even told them that the US was planning to use the bomb against Japan. In 1950, he was discovered and imprisoned in the United Kingdom. He confessed and pled guilty, but was still given the harshest sentence possible for espionage in the UK. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. But this video isn't about Fuchs. It is about the couple that stole the bomb. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg was the high watermark of the Red Scare. This was the time of Joseph McCarthy. People thought that there were millions of communists loyal to the Soviet Union who were undermining America and preparing to launch a revolution in the United States. How on earth did the political climate in the United States become so fearful? Well, the US had allied itself with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War. After Germany's defeat, the Soviet Union's territorial expansion in Eastern Europe, alongside the United States' belief that the Soviets wanted to spread communism around the world, led to the two countries becoming rivals. There was great fear at the time that the Soviets had the military power to overwhelm the United States' continental European allies. But America felt safe in the fact that the Soviets wouldn't attack, since a unilateral nuclear strike would counteract any Soviet advantage in men and material. Then, on September 23, 1949, Americans were greeted by the headlines that the Soviets had successfully tested a nuclear weapon. The American atomic monopoly was no more. Scientists and experts were initially baffled as to how the Soviets had created the bomb so quickly. Then, in 1950, Klaus Fuchs was caught, and it became obvious. The Soviets stole the bomb. There had already been some previous fear concerning Soviet spies infiltrating the USA, but now it had become a full-blown hysteria. Magazines printed articles about the number of communists the FBI knew about in each state and suggested that they were all part of Stalin's spy network. These articles painted New York as a communist spy nest. This suspicion of people and fear of spies became worse after the Rosenbergs' alleged spy ring started collapsing. Every time a member was caught, newspapers would be full of the newest allegations. Even aside from spying, there was a fear of communists trying to overthrow the government. In 1949, the leaders of the Communist Party USA were put on trial for violating the Smith Act. This was a law that outlawed advocating for the overthrow of the US government by force. During the 10-month trial, nearly every day there were protesters outside the courthouse supporting the 11 communist leaders. But it made no difference. All 11 were found guilty, even though there was no evidence that they had taken specific steps to violently overthrow the government. Just advocating for a revolution was enough to earn them all 5 years in jail. In the exact same courthouse, 2 years later, the Rosenbergs would go on trial for a conspiracy to commit espionage, and if found guilty, they could be subject to the death penalty. Now, we're going to go through the prosecution and the defense's evidence, and you can decide for yourself whether you believe that they are guilty or not guilty. The basic premise is that Julius and his wife Ethel formed a conspiracy with other people to deliver secret information to the Soviet Union. Specifically, they got Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who was working as an army machinist in Los Alamos, to transfer classified information about the atomic bomb to them. They did this for multiple years, and after Klaus Fuchs was arrested, and it seemed that the Rosenbergs would be caught, they made plans to escape to the Soviet Union. Now, the first thing that we have to get out of the way is that there is basically no physical evidence. This case is built almost completely on the testimony of the Rosenbergs' co-conspirators. The lack of physical evidence may seem very weak in the 21st century, but it's worth keeping in mind that this happened in the 50s, before the internet, phones, or DNA testing, so it was much less abnormal to have a case built solely on witness testimony back then. But obviously, feel free to judge the case by whichever standard you wish. The prosecution basically needs to prove only two things: that the Rosenbergs were members of a conspiracy, and that any one overt act was made by the Rosenbergs or by any of their co-conspirators. So, let's introduce two of the prosecution's key witnesses. David Greenglass is Ethel Rosenbergs' brother. During the Second World War, David joined the army, and since he was a qualified machinist, he ended up working on the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. He testified about having had conversations with the Rosenbergs about communism being a superior economic system to capitalism. This made him a prime recruitment target for the Rosenbergs' spy ring. The other key witness is Ruth Greenglass. She is David's wife, and thus Ethel Rosenbergs' sister-in-law. Both the Greenglasses' testimonies match each other very closely, so if David claims something, you can assume that Ruth said it too. The last thing to keep in mind is that the Greengrasses are both co-conspirators. David has pleaded guilty and will be sentenced alongside the Rosenbergs after this trial. Ruth, however, has not been indicted, so I'm going to play their testimonies now, and as you are listening, pay attention to what they are claiming, because this is the core of the prosecution's case. If the Greenglasses are believed, the Rosenbergs will be found guilty, and a death sentence is a strong possibility.
Julius Rosenberg said that for 2 years he had been trying to get in touch with people who would assist him to be able to help the Russian people more directly, other than just his membership in the Communist Party. And he went on to tell me that he knew that David was working on the atomic bomb, and I asked him how he knew what David was doing. He said that his friends had told him that David was working on the atomic bomb, and he went on to tell me that the atomic bomb was the most destructive weapon used so far, that it had dangerous radiation effects, that the United States and Britain were working on this project jointly, and that he felt that the information should be shared with Russia, who was our ally at the time, because if all nations had the information, then one nation couldn't use the bomb as a threat against another. He said that he wanted me to tell my husband David that he should give information to Julius to be passed on to the Russians. And at first I objected to this. I didn't think it was right. I said that the people who are in charge of the work on the bomb were in a better position to know whether the information should be shared or not. Ethel Rosenberg said that I should at least tell it to David, that she felt that this was right for David, that he would want it, that I should give him the message and let him decide for himself. I decided to give my husband the message, and Julius Rosenberg told me the things that he wanted me to ask my husband, the information that he wanted me to bring back. Julius also gave me $150.
Did he state what the purpose, why he was giving you the money?
Well, it was towards the expenses of my trip.
My wife came to visit me in Albuquerque on our second wedding anniversary. It was November 29th, 1944. We went for a walk, and my wife started the conversation. My wife said that the Rosenbergs wanted me to give information about the atomic bomb to the Russians. She told me that she didn't think it was a good idea. At first, she asked me what I thought about that. I was frightened and worried about it, and I told her that I wouldn't do it. So, later on that night after this conversation, I thought about it, and the following morning I told my wife that I would give the information.
He said that Los Alamos had formerly been a riding academy, that it was 40 miles from Santa Fe and about 110 miles from Albuquerque, that the project itself was on the top of a hill, and it was secluded. You could hardly see it until you were almost on top of it, that there was a guard at the entrance at all times, and everyone was checked going in and out. He told me the names of the scientists, Dr. Urey, Dr. Oppenheimer, Kistiakowski, Niels Bohr. David told me that he worked in an experimental shop, that he made models from blueprints that scientists brought into him.
Now, when your husband related this information to you, did you write it down, or what did you do with it?
No, I memorized it. He told it to me, and then I repeated it to make sure that I remembered all the details.
After you arrived back in New York City, did you see the defendant, Julius Rosenberg?
Yes, he came to my house. I told him that David had consented to give him the information. He said that he was very pleased, and he asked me to tell him the information that David had sent through me. I repeated what David had told me for him, and then he asked me to write it down for him. I wrote it down for him, and he waited for the information. I told him also that my husband was expecting a furlough very shortly afterwards, and he was coming back to New York.
After your arrival in New York on your furlough, did there come a time when you saw the defendant, Julius Rosenberg?
He came up to the apartment and he got me out of bed, and we went into another room so my wife could dress. Well, he said to me he would have to give me an idea of what the bomb was about so that I would be able to know what I am looking for. He then gave me a description of what I later found out to be was the bomb that was dropped at Hiroshima. He asked me to give him any information I had, specifically anything of value on the atomic bomb, whatever I knew about it. He asked me what I was doing out there, and I told him I was working on lenses, high-explosive lens molds.
Did you do any writing at that time?
I wrote up the information he wanted that evening. It included sketches on the lens molds and how they were used in experiments.
A quick pause here. These sketches are not the original ones that David claims he gave to Julius. Those drawings are in Russia at this point. These are recreations Greenglass made while being questioned by the FBI. It's worth noting that these lenses are used on an implosion type bomb. This is the type of bomb dropped on Nagasaki, which uses a different method for causing a nuclear explosion than the Hiroshima gun type bomb. To oversimplify, to cause a nuclear chain reaction, you just need fissile material like plutonium or uranium and neutrons. Then, you just need to compress this material, and a nuclear chain reaction will occur, causing a massive explosion. The hard part is compressing the material. The United States developed two methods to do this for the Manhattan Project. There's the gun method, which basically involves shooting a piece of uranium at a uranium target. This is the kind of bomb that Julius Rosenberg already knew about and explained to David. The compression method that David is working on is an implosion type device, which is basically putting a bunch of explosives around a plutonium core and squeezing it from all sides. This is obviously pretty difficult, since all the explosions need to happen at basically the exact same time, and the explosives need to be just the right shape to uniformly compress the plutonium. So David is here giving a crude drawing that gives the shape of the explosive charges. He also gave a more detailed description in writing. Anyway, back to the testimony.
Did you give Julius Rosenberg anything else?
I also gave him a list of scientists who were on the project. He said he wanted a list of people who seemed sympathetic with communism and would help furnish information to the Russians. My wife, in passing, remarked that the handwriting would be bad and would need interpretation, and Julius said there was nothing to worry about as Ethel would type it up, retype the information. He also invited us to dinner that evening. When I got to their apartment with my wife that evening, there was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and a woman by the name of Anne Sidorovich.
Julius Rosenberg said that he had Anne Sidorovich come to his apartment so that we would be able to recognize her, and she know us when she came out to us in Albuquerque to get new information from David to bring back to New York.
Now, was there any further conversation between you and your wife and the Rosenbergs on that evening?
We discussed my wife coming out to live with me in New Mexico. The Rosenbergs told my wife that she wouldn't have to worry about money because it would be taken care of. I mean, she would be able to get out there and live out there. If she wasn't able to work, the money would be forthcoming.
At some point, it was brought up what would happen if Anne couldn't come out west to pick up the information. Julius said that someone else would be sent. So I asked him, how would we know who the other party was? How would we be able to identify him? Well, Julius took the side of a Jell-O box and cut it in an odd fashion, and he gave me one half, and he said, "This half will be brought to you by another party, and he will bear the greetings from me, and you will know that I have sent him." David said it was very clever, and Julius said, "The simplest things are always clever."
Now, after that, was there a discussion between the four of you?
Well, David and Julius had a technical discussion, and Ethel and I were talking on the side. Ethel said that she was tired, and I asked her what she had been doing. She said she had been typing, and I asked her if she had found David's notes hard to distinguish. She said no, she was used to his handwriting.
A few nights later, well, an appointment was made for me to meet a Russian.
Who made the appointment?
Julius made the appointment. I took my father-in-law's car and drove up there. It was about 11:30 at night. I remember coming up the street. It was quite dark, and there was a lighted window. I passed that in parking. It was a saloon. I parked up the block from it, and in a little while Julius came around the corner, looked into the car, saw who I was, said, "I will be right back," brought back a man, introduced the man to me by first name, that I don't recall at this time, and the man got into the car with me. Julius stayed right there, and we drove around.
Let me see if I understand it. When you say Julius stayed right there, was Julius in the car or not?
He was not in the car. He remained on the street. Well, the Russian and I drove all over that area. He just told me to keep driving, and he asked questions about lenses.
All right. About when did you leave New York and return to Los Alamos?
About the 20th of January, 1945.
Did your wife go with you?
She did not go with me.
Did you, in ensuing months, gather information concerning the atom bomb?
I would usually have access to other points in the project, and also I was friendly with a number of people in various parts of the project, and whenever a conversation would take place on something I didn't know about, I would listen very avidly and question the speakers as to clarify what they had said. I would do this surreptitiously so that they wouldn't catch me.
Did there come a time when your wife joined you in Albuquerque?
She did.
Down in Albuquerque, I was having some medical problems. I wrote Ethel Rosenberg a letter, telling her that I had had a miscarriage and was confined to bed. Ethel wrote back that she was sympathetic about my illness, and that a member of the family would come out to visit me the last weeks in May.
This brings us to the next member of the conspiracy. Harry Gold is a Philadelphia-based biochemist, but that's not relevant in this case. He is in court because of his courier activities. On multiple occasions, he transported nuclear information from New Mexico to New York. He joined the spy ring in 1944 and was recruited by Anatoly Yakovlev. Yakovlev was allegedly also Rosenberg's handler and was known as the Russian. Yakovlev escaped back to the Soviet Union by boat before he was caught. Harry Gold, on the other hand, was one of the links that led to the Rosenbergs being discovered. Gold had collected nuclear secrets from Klaus Fuchs and transported them to Yakovlev in Manhattan. When Fuchs was captured in the UK, he implicated Gold, who implicated David Greenglass, which led to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Gold was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Here is his testimony.
On Sunday about 8:30 I went again to the High Street address. I was admitted, and I recall going up a very steep flight of steps and knocked on a door. It was opened by a young man of about 23 with dark hair. He was smiling. I said, "Mr. Greenglass?" He answered in the affirmative. I said, "I came from Julius."
And I said, "Oh." And I walked to my wife's purse, took out the wallet, and took out the matched part of the Jell-O box. I offered Mr. Gold something to eat, and he said he had already eaten. He just wanted to know if I had any information, and I said, "I have some, but I will have to write it up. If you come back in the afternoon, I will give it to you."
Did you return to the home of the Greenglasses on the same day?
Yes, I did.
And what time did you return?
It was about between 3 and 4 o'clock. Mr. Greenglass gave me an envelope which he said contained the information for which I had come. The information on the atom bomb. I took the envelope. Mr. Greenglass told me that he expected to get a furlough sometime around Christmas, and that he would return to New York at that time. He told me that if I wished to get in touch with him, then I could do so by calling his brother-in-law Julius, and he gave me the telephone number of Julius in New York City.
Did Harry Gold give anything to either you or your husband?
Yes, he gave David a white envelope that was sealed.
Did you have any discussion with Gold about the money?
Yes, I did. He said, "Will it be enough?" And I said, "Well, it will be plenty for the present." And he said, "You need it." And we went into a side discussion about the fact that my wife had a miscarriage earlier in the spring. And he said, "Well, I will see what I can do about getting some more money for you."
After Mr. Gold left, David opened the envelope and he found $500.
Now what happened to that 500?
David gave the money to me, and on the next day I deposited $400 in the Albuquerque Trust and Savings Bank. And I bought a defense bond for $50, and the rest I used for household expenses.
Now, I call your attention to September of 1945. Do you recall that in that month David received a furlough from the Army?
Yes. We came to New York and we stayed at my mother-in-law's house.
Did there come a time when Julius Rosenberg came to visit you?
I told Julius I had a pretty good description of the atom bomb. He said he would like to have it immediately. As soon as I possibly could get it written up, he would like to get it. Oh, besides that, during this conversation, he gave me $200 and he told me to come over to his house. I then went to see he then left and I was there alone with my wife.
My husband and I spoke about it. I did not want him to give the information to Julius. The bomb had already been dropped on Hiroshima and I realized exactly what it was, and I didn't feel that the information should be passed on. However, David said that he was going to give it to him again. David wrote out the information, and as soon as it was all done, he and I went over to Julius and Ethel's apartment.
Well, I gave Julius my notes and stepped into another room, and he read it and he came out and he said, "This is very good. We ought to have this typed up immediately." And my wife said, "We will probably have to correct the grammar involved, because I was more interested in writing down the technical phrases of it than I was in correcting the grammar." So they had a bridge table, and they brought it into the living room, plus a typewriter.
After the typewriter was produced, Ethel was typing the notes and David was helping her when she couldn't make out his handwriting, and explained the technical terms and spelled them out for her. And Julius and I helped her with the phraseology when it got a little too lengthy, wordy.
Was there any further conversation before leaving the apartment?
I just stated that as soon as I could possibly get out, I was going to go out of the Army, get a discharge.
What did Julius say?
He said he'd want me to stay up in Los Alamos if I could get a job up there as a civilian, stay there as a civilian, so I could continue to give information.
What did you say?
I said I would like to leave the place. I would like to come home.
Now, after the furlough was completed, where did you and your husband go?
We went back to Albuquerque.
And for what length of time did you remain in Albuquerque?
Until the first week of March, after his discharge when we came back to New York.
I went into business with Julius Rosenberg and my brother and a man by the name of Goldstein.
How long did you remain in business with Rosenberg and your brother?
Until August 1949.
Now, what type of businesses were these, just in general terms?
Machine shops.
Did Julius Rosenberg encourage you to again get involved in helping the Soviet Union during this time?
Well, in 46 or 47, Julius Rosenberg made an offer to me to have the Russians pay for part of my schooling, and the GI Bill of Rights to pay for the other part, and that I should go to college for the purpose of cultivating the friendships of people that I had known at Los Alamos, and also to acquire new friendships with people who were in the field of research that are in those colleges, like physics and nuclear energy.
Did he specifically say how much of this money would be furnished by the Russians?
He specified that the GI Bill of Rights would pay for my schooling, and they would give a certain amount of money for living of the student, and he said the Russians would pay additional money so I could live more comfortably. But I decided not to go back to school.
In February of 1950, did Julius inform you that there was an FBI investigation that may lead to you?
Yes. He asked me to go for a walk with him, and we went down the street and in the park. And during this walk, he spoke to me of Fuchs. He told me, he said, "You remember the man who came to see you in Albuquerque? Well, Fuchs was also one of his contacts, and this man who came to see me in Albuquerque would undoubtedly be arrested soon, and if so, would lead to me. And Rosenberg said to me that I would have to leave the country. Think it over, and we will make plans to go." Well, I told him that I would need money to pay my debts back, so I would be able to leave with a clear head. And Rosenberg said that he didn't think it was necessary to worry about it, but I insisted on it, so he said he would get the money for me from the Russians.
Did Julius contact you after Gold was arrested?
Yes. Julius came in with a copy of the Herald Tribune of that morning, and it had a great big picture in it of Harry Gold.
Where did he tell you that you should go to?
To the Soviet Union.
Did he give you instructions on how to get out of the country?
First, I was to go to the border area of Mexico, and at the border area, get a tourist card. In other words, not to get the tourist card at some Mexican consulate in this city, but to wait till we get to the border. He then told me I would have to have passport pictures made up as soon as possible.
Passport pictures?
6 sets.
What did you do with those 6 sets?
We gave 5 to Julius, and I kept the 6th set.
Was anything else said concerning arrangements for leaving?
Yes, he gave my husband $1,000. He said, buy everything you need. Don't be too obvious in your spending. You have a month to spend it in, and I will bring you more. He said, leave all your household effects. Just take your clothing and what you need for the children and leave. Julius asked me if I could get a certificate from the doctor, stating that we had all been inoculated against smallpox. I said that I would not ask the doctor for a falsified statement. He said, that is all right. I will take care of it. My doctor will give it to me.
Did Rosenberg tell you what you were to do once you made it to Mexico?
He gave me a certain form letter to memorize and sign I. Jackson at the end of the letter. This letter was to be used when I get to Mexico City. I was to write to the secretary to the ambassador of the Soviet Union and state in that letter. I don't recall completely right now, but something to the effect about the position of the Soviet Union in the UN. Then I was to wait 3 days at some place. I was to go with a guide to the city in my hand with my middle finger between the pages of the guide, go to a place called Place de la Colonne and look at the statue of Columbus there. I was then to wait until some man was to come up close to me, and then I would say, that is a magnificent statue, and that I was from Oklahoma, and I hadn't seen a statue like it before. And this man was to say, oh, there are much more beautiful statues in Paris. That was to be our identification. Then he was to give me my passports and additional money so that I could go on with my trip. I was to continue on to Veracruz and then to Sweden or Switzerland, one or the other. I would, in Sweden, after sending a letter to the ambassador of the Soviet Union, I was to go to the statue of Linnaeus in Stockholm and repeat the procedure. Then I was to be given my means of transportation to Czechoslovakia, and that is where I was to go.
Did you have any further conversation with Rosenberg on that day?
Well, that was the end of the conversation on that day, except that he said that he had to leave the country himself, and he was making plans for it. And I said, why you? He said that he was a friend that he knew Jacob Golos, this man Golos, and probably Bentley knew him.
When was this subject of your leaving the country again raised between yourselves and Julius Rosenberg?
He came on Memorial Day to pick up the pictures from my husband, and he told him to get ready to leave.
Then when did you, after Memorial Day, see Rosenberg again?
He came on June 4th to our house. He gave my husband a package wrapped in brown paper, and he said it was $4,000, that there would be more money available in Mexico when we got there.
He then told me, let's go for a walk, because he wants to have me repeat the instructions he had given me.
Instructions he had given you and told you to memorize?
That is right. The instructions of how to get to Czechoslovakia. I then went down Columbia Street to Delancey Street, and on the way, I met 2 friends.
What did you do with the $4,000?
We put it in the chimney in our fireplace, and afterwards my husband gave it to my brother-in-law.
When did you see Rosenberg on the next occasion?
About 3 days later.
And where did you see him?
He came into our apartment and said,
He spoke in whispers. He said he thought he was being followed.
He had just come back from upstate to see people and was planning to go to Cleveland, but said, I am not going anymore.
He was going to bring 2,000 more for us, but he didn't because he was being extra careful.
He said to me, what are you going to do now? I said, I am not going to do anything. I am going to sit. I am going to stay right here. And he left.
Now, do you know when your husband David was arrested by the federal officers?
Yes.
Approximately when was that?
About the middle of June 1950.
After your husband was arrested, did you see Ethel Rosenberg?
Yes. Ethel came with pie for me and gifts for my son, and after we talked in my mother-in-law's house for a few minutes, she asked me would I please go out and walk with her. We walked around the block several times, and she said her counsel advised her to see me personally and get assurances from me that David would not talk. She said it would only be a matter of a couple of years, and in the long run we would be better off, that Julius had been picked up by the FBI for questioning. He said he was innocent and that he had been released, that she had no doubt that he would probably be picked up again. He would continue to say he was innocent, that if David said he was innocent and Julius said he was innocent, it would strengthen their position. Everybody would stand a better chance. And she said, "Do you think it is a dirty shame for David to take the blame and sit for 2?"
Another person who implicated Julius Rosenberg is Elizabeth Bentley. She joined the American Communist Party in 1935 before becoming an underground covert agent in 1938. There, she facilitated the movement of secret information to Moscow. In 1947, she flipped, becoming a double agent working for the FBI before being pulled out and testifying about the underground activities of the Communist Party at a congressional panel. She described how even before becoming an underground agent, just being an above-board member of the Communist Party involved infiltrating groups and institutions to spread communist ideology for the benefits of Moscow. Then, going underground, she worked for Jacob Golos until his death in 1943. She said that he was one of the heads of the covert communist operation in the USA. Bentley's main job was collecting secret information provided to her by communists in the American government and then giving it to Golos, who then transported it directly to the Soviet embassy. She describes accompanying Golos to somewhere near Knickerbocker Village in the fall of 1942. There, they receive an envelope from somebody that Golos said was an engineer. The Rosenbergs lived in Knickerbocker Village at this time, by the way. Bentley said that she didn't get a good look at the engineer since she was too far away. She also described having phone calls with somebody who called themselves Julius. These calls occurred to organize meetings between Julius and Golos and kept happening until the end of 1943. While Bentley admitted that she didn't recognize Julius's voice, she learned through those calls that Julius lived in Knickerbocker Village. There is one more person who testified at the trial who has a very damning account. But before we get to that, we need to talk about Morton Sobell. He is on trial alongside the Rosenbergs. It is alleged that he was part of the conspiracy and he passed secret documents to Julius Rosenberg, who had been his classmate in college. There is a very simple reason why Morton Sobell has not been brought up so far. That's because I didn't need to. The only evidence against Sobell is our last witness and also the fact that Sobell allegedly tried to escape to Mexico when the conspiracy was collapsing. Which brings us to Max Ellicher. He went to college with Julius and Morton. Here is his story.
Do you recall a conversation sometime in 1939 with Sobell regarding the Communist Party?
Well, we were living together in an apartment together, and soon after moving in, he asked me about joining the Young Communist League. At the time, I said no, and for some period he continued to ask me about it, and I finally did make such a move. I went to a meeting for the Young Communists. However, when I attended this meeting, it turned out that the group was being organized as a group or cell of the Communist Party, and it was this which I joined.
Did you thereafter attend meetings of this cell with Sobell?
Yes, I did.
In 1939, after moving to Washington, did Sobell encourage you to join another group?
Well, the group that I came down to when I joined, I think there were about maybe 15 people there, and we were divided up into groups, into smaller groups, and I met only with 3 or 4 people at a time.
Was there anything common about the members of this group of 4 or 5 you told us about in respect to their employment?
Yes, I would say all of them were members of the government.
Will you tell us something about the meetings of that group? Where were they held?
The meetings were held in the homes of the various members in sort of rotation.
How about the payment of dues? Was there any payment of dues for the membership?
Dues were paid at the meetings, yes. They were paid to someone who was the chairman or called the chairman of the group.
Was there any time when Sobell acted as chairman of the group?
Yes. At the beginning, at these first meetings, he was chairman. I don't recall how long he stayed the chairman.
Did you receive any instructions from Sobell as chairman of the meeting?
Yes, instructions would come from the chairman. Well, there was a suggestion, recommendation to join certain organizations in Washington, organizations that were operating in Washington. One of them was the American Peace Mobilization. When the American Youth Congress had its Congress in Washington, there was a suggestion to assist them to help in the activity.
At this time, do you recall what the situation was in respect to the Hitler-Stalin Pact?
Yes. Well, the pact was in effect and support was to be obtained for the pact for the Soviet Union's position, and we were to talk with people and to get general support for the existence of the pact and its aims.
How long did you and Sobell continue attending these communist group meetings?
Well, it would continue until September 1941.
Did there come a time that you were contacted by Julius Rosenberg?
I received a phone call from a person who said he was Julius Rosenberg. He said that he was a former classmate. I remembered the name. I recalled who it was, and he said he would like to see me. He came over after supper, and my wife was there, and we had a casual conversation. After that, he asked if my wife would leave the room, that he wanted to speak to me in private. She did, and he then said to me, he talked to me first about the job that the Soviet Union was doing in the war effort, and how at present a good deal of military information was being denied them by some interests in the United States, and because of that, their effort was being impeded. He said that there were many people who were implementing aid to the Soviet Union by providing classified information about military equipments, and so forth, and asked whether in my capacity at the Bureau of Ordnance would I have access to, and would I be able to get such information, and would I turn it over to him. He asked about any plans or blueprints or anything that might be of value, and that all these things are needed, and that the choice would not be mine if I had some such information. They should be turned over, and someone would evaluate them. He said that this information, if I would agree to do so, should be taken to New York, to him, and he would have it processed photographically and the material would be returned. He said that this would be done in a very safe manner, that is, would be brought one night. It would be processed immediately so it could be returned before it was missed. He also indicated the security of these means, that is, that the material was to be carried in containers which would offer protection. That is, the film would be exposed if tampered with by unauthorized people, and he generally tried to assure me that the operation would be safe as far as I was concerned. He had said there were others contributing. He told me Sobell is helping too. No other names were mentioned, but there were also others contributing in this way.
Did he describe to you the type of material that he was interested in getting?
Well, yes. The interest was mainly for plans or reports or books regarding military equipment, new military equipment, anything that might be of any value, of any assistance to the Soviet Union.
A few months after meeting Rosenberg, do you recall seeing Sobell and his wife?
Yes. I told him that, well, I had wanted to tell him so that I could be sure of my position. So I said to him that Julius Rosenberg had visited me some time ago, a short time ago at my home, and had asked me whether I would contribute military information to Russia, and in the course of that he had said you, Sobell, were also helping in this. At this point he became very angry and said he should not have mentioned my name. He should not have told you that. I tried to explain that Rosenberg knew of our close relationship, and you probably knew that he had seen me, so he probably felt safe about it. He said he was still angry and said, it makes no difference. He shouldn't have done it.
Did you see Rosenberg again in the summer of 1945?
Yes. My wife and I had again taken a vacation of a few days and we were staying in New York. We first stayed at my mother's house. My wife was dissatisfied, and we were looking for another place to stay. We had called Rosenberg. In the course of our talk, he suggested that we could stay at his place. His wife was in the country, and so we could use his apartment.
Did there come a time when Julius Rosenberg spoke to you about his government employment?
I don't remember whether he told me he had left or been discharged, or whether he was up for discharge.
But he did say for security reasons?
Well, it had something to do with some statement that had been presented regarding membership in the party, the Communist Party or party activities, and I don't recall the complete substance of it. He said he had been worried for quite some time, for weeks about this case, because he thought it had to do with this espionage activity, but he was quite relieved to find out it only had to do with the party activity.
When you were back in Washington, did there come a time in September of 1945 that Rosenberg called you again?
Yes. He was at the station, at Union Station in Washington. He had come into the city and said he wanted to speak to me. He came over to the house. Well, the war was over, and he was saying that even though the war was over, there was a continuing need for new military information for Russia, and again was trying to get my views about it, whether I would want to contribute in the future.
Was there any discussion between you regarding the type of work you were engaged in at the time in the Bureau of Ordnance in the Navy Department?
Well, I told him that I was working on some sonar or anti-submarine fire control devices.
Did there come a time that you met with Sobell again?
In early 1946, I had a business trip to Schenectady, New York. I was visiting the General Electric plant, and Sobell was working there at the time. We talked about our work, about what I was doing and what he was doing, and he inquired about some as to whether there were pamphlets written. He asked if there were any reports written about this system on which I was working.
When did you see Sobell again?
Well, I saw him again later that year at his home in Schenectady.
Did you have any conversation with him about these pamphlets?
Well, we had a discussion about our work, talking about what we were doing. In addition, he asked me about the status of this pamphlet which I had previously mentioned. I told him it was not completed, it was dragging along, it had not been finished yet.
Was there any further discussion?
Yes, there was a suggestion made to me to visit Rosenberg. I had not seen him and the suggestion was made, and I said I would do so at some future opportunity.
Thereafter, did you see Rosenberg?
Yes, I did, at the home of Rosenberg. When I came there, I told him that I seen Sobell, but he had suggested seeing him. I told him about my new work. I was perhaps in a more receptive frame of mind for him, and he then interrupted and told me that they were having some difficulty, felt that there was a leak in this espionage, and because of that, there were precautions being taken by him. He told me it would be best if I don't see him, if I don't visit him, that I don't come to see him until he lets me know or until someone informs me. And he added that it would be best if I discontinued any of my Union and Communist Party activities, that it would be much safer. I told him I couldn't, that was what I was doing. That was my life down in Washington and I could not withdraw. He insisted, but there were no conclusions resulting from it and I left.
Did you again see Sobell in 1947?
Yes. Sobell made a request for names or information about any engineering students that I might know, who were progressive, as I have testified before, and asked whether, if I knew of any such people, would I let him know. I told him I didn't know anybody. However, if somebody came along, I would tell him about it.
About that time, do you recall a conversation with Sobell relating to your wife?
He became concerned and asked whether she knew anything about this espionage business. I told him I thought that she might know. However, I wasn't sure. He said, "Well, that isn't good." And I said, "Well, it is just too bad. If she knows, and I just can't do anything about it."
Did there come a time that you spoke to Sobell about your future employment plans?
Yes, I had been informed. Well, my plans for leaving the Bureau of Ordnance started some months before I left. I had been telling him about it, telling him that I had been planning to make a change. However, I hadn't made up my mind, when I finally did decide to leave, which was about in June of 1948, again on the occasion of a visit to New York on business, I called him and told him that I was planning to leave the Bureau, that I had definitely decided to do so. He said, "Don't do anything before you see me, I want to talk to you about it, and Rosenberg also wants to speak to you about it." He made an appointment for me to meet Rosenberg, which I did. This was about 6:30 in the evening. There was a meeting with Rosenberg. Sobell also came along and we walked up 3rd Avenue and some of the side streets and discussed this matter. I told him I had decided to leave Washington. He said that was too bad, that he was sorry to hear it, because he wanted me to stay there at the Bureau of Ordnance. He needed somebody to work at the Navy Department for this espionage purposes, and he wanted me to change my mind. He said that he also had some plans in his pocket for me to make a contact in Washington to meet somebody, to establish a contact. I told him that I would not do so. I would not change my plans to leave. My wife and I wanted to leave and we were going to leave. Sobell was along and I recall that he agreed with Rosenberg in his, trying to convince me to stay down at the Bureau of Ordnance. However, I convinced him that I was not going to change my plans. I was going to leave Washington. So that ended that part of the conversation. Sobell left and Rosenberg and I had dinner together.
What was the conversation in the course of that dinner?
Well, among other things, we continued to talk about this espionage, not relating to my leaving or not leaving. He spoke of, he asked whether I knew of places where important military work was done. I mentioned the Bell Telephone Laboratories to him. He was interested in my getting a position there and I said, "We'll see, maybe I can, I don't know." He also told me about the fact that money could be made available for my education, if I so desired, if I wanted to take courses which would improve my technical status. In the course of that conversation, I also asked him about how he had started in this venture, and he told me that he had a long time ago decided that this was what he wanted to do. And he made it his point to get close to people in the Communist Party, he said. He didn't specify any person or their positions, and kept getting close from one person to another until he was able to approach someone, a Russian. Again, he didn't specify who or what he was, who would listen to his proposition concerning this matter of getting information to Russia.
Did he say that he finally succeeded in getting to somebody?
Yes, he did.
Did there come a time when you went to work for the Reeves Instrument Company with Sobell?
Yes. In July of 1948, I was coming up to look for a place to live, and my family and I drove up to New York. We were going to stay at the home of the Sobells during the search for a home, a permanent home. On the way up to New York, upon leaving Baltimore, we had stopped to buy some dishes and we went off the main road, and on coming back I noticed that I was being followed. I then proceeded on to Sobell's. When I got there, we had one child, and we put the child to bed. I called Sobell aside and told him that I thought that I had been followed by 1 or 2 cars from Washington to New York. At this point, he became very angry and said that I should not have come to the house under those circumstances. I told him that those were my plans. I had planned to come to his house to stay. The fact that I was followed couldn't change it. Whoever was following me would probably know about it. In any case, it was our only destination. He was still angry and concerned. However, he didn't seem to believe that I had been followed. He told me I should leave the house. I should go to a place in the mountains, perhaps, or some other place and stay. During this next interval, I told him that it was not possible. I didn't know where to go. I just had nothing. I could see no other thing to do but to stay. He finally agreed that I would stay. However, a short time later, he came over to me and said he had some valuable information in the house, something that he should have given to Julius Rosenberg some time ago and had not done so. It was too valuable to be destroyed, and yet too dangerous to keep around. He said he wanted to deliver it to Rosenberg that night. I told him it was foolish under the circumstances, that it was dangerous. It was a silly thing to do. However, he insisted and said that he was tired. He asked me to go along. He said he was tired and that he might not be able to make the trip back. I agreed to go after an argument, and we left the house. Upon leaving, I saw him take what I identified then as a 35mm film can. No reference was made to it. He took it. When we got into the car, he put it in the glove compartment. We drove. He drove over to Manhattan. He left the car. He told me to park the car on the street around the corner. He took this can out of the glove compartment and left, and I drove up the street. He came back approximately a half hour later, or perhaps a little shorter, and as we drove off, I turned to him and said, "Well, what does Julie think about this, my being followed?" He said, "It is all right. Don't be concerned about it. It is okay." He then said Rosenberg had told him that he once talked to Elizabeth Bentley on the phone, but he was pretty sure she didn't know who he was, and therefore everything was all right. We proceeded back to the house.
Was there anything about some equipment that you noticed in Sobell's home that you care tell us about?
Well, he had photographic equipment. He had a 35, a Leica camera, and an enlarger and material for processing film.
When you found your new home in New York, did you and Sobell live near each other?
Yes, we were back to back actually.
When was the last time that you saw Sobell?
Well, I believe it was sometime in June of 1950.
This brings us to our final piece of evidence, the escape. The prosecution did claim that the Rosenbergs made some initial steps to leave the country. For example, they'd passport pictures taken. But the Rosenbergs were picked up by the FBI before they fully committed to their escape attempt. Morton Sobell, on the other hand, made it to Mexico. Sobell went to Mexico City with his family. There, they rented an apartment and he befriended his neighbor, Mr. Rios. This was despite a considerable language barrier between the two. Mr. Rios testified that Sobell told him that he was escaping the US since he was afraid of going back to the army as he had seen war. Sobell also asked Mr. Rios if it was possible to leave Mexico without proper papers. After this idea was shot down, Sobell went on a trip away from Mexico City for 15 days. He did not bring his family with him and wrote letters that were for his wife but sent them to Mr. Rios. Mr. Rios then gave them to Helen Sobell. During these 15 days, Sobell went to Veracruz and Tampico. He used fake names while on his journey. Mr. Sand to get glasses in Veracruz. On his hotel registration in that city, he used Morris Sand. On his flight from Veracruz to Tampico, it was N. Sand. For his hotel in Tampico, it was Marvin Salt. And for his flight back to Mexico City, it was Morton Salt. After returning to Mexico City, he was extradited back to the United States and arrested by the FBI. The level that this escape is similar to the instructions that Julius gave David Greenglass is for you to decide. But it's worth keeping in mind that David started telling his story before Sobell fled. So if Sobell's escape plan resembles what Greenglass testified to, that would go towards proving that they were both involved in the conspiracy. That pretty much concludes the basic evidence of the case. Now, it's worth noting that the defendants are not just accused of providing information about the atomic bomb to the Soviets. They apparently also passed on documents about the proximity fuse used in anti-air systems, an atomic-powered aircraft, and Sky platform, which is a vehicle that is suspended at a point of gravitational equilibrium between the Earth and the Moon. Obviously, some of those projects didn't pan out for the United States. Anyway, for each defendant, if you determine that having seen the evidence, it proves beyond a reasonable doubt that they were part of the conspiracy and that any overt act occurred as part of the conspiracy, then they are guilty. The overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy are Julius visiting Ellicher in Washington around D-Day 1944, Julius and Ethel's meeting with Ruth to convince her to get David involved in supplying them secret information, Julius and Ethel giving Ruth the $200 for her trip, Ruth Greenglass going to New Mexico, Julius visiting Ruth to get the information David provided her, Julius receiving the notes that Ruth wrote down from her memory, Julius and Ethel meeting Ruth and David while David was on furlough in New York, Julius giving Ruth the torn Jell-O box, Julius introducing David to the Russian who was then driven around and given information, Julius and David talking about the bomb after the car ride with the Russian, David giving Julius the bomb sketches, and David going back to New York after the furlough. Now, it is not enough to simply show that any one of these happened. The evidence needs to prove that one of these happened in furtherance of the conspiracy. So Julius visiting Ruth's apartment isn't enough. The evidence needs to show that he went there to get the secret information that David had given Ruth. An overt act also doesn't need to successfully contribute to the conspiracy. For example, if Julius had gone to Ruth's apartment to get the information but Ruth had forgotten it, that would still be an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. An overt act also doesn't need to be illegal on its own. It just needs to be part of the conspiracy. We don't need individual illegal acts, since the success of the conspiracy would involve the transmission of secret information related to national defense to the Soviet Union with the intention or having reason to believe that that information was to be used to the advantage of the Soviet Union. The whole conspiracy is a crime, not the individual actions. But in this case, the conspirators didn't just aspire to transfer secret information to the Soviets. They succeeded. They gave the blueprints to the most dangerous weapon in the world to their country's Cold War rival. That is why this trial is such a big deal, and that is why the Rosenbergs are facing the death penalty if convicted. The defendants have one opportunity to dodge the electric chair, and they are relying solely on their defense counsel. Let's see if Emanuel Hirsch Bloch can be the Rosenbergs' savior.